Hi, I'm Michael Brownlee, co-founder of the Monastery Academy for Conscious Evolution and Co-Creation. And in this video, I want to talk with you about humanity's unfolding existential crisis and the possibility of extinction. To begin, we now know that we're living at the very moment of the beginning of the collapse of human civilization and the near-term collapse of human population and the collapse of the biosphere. There's not much room for debate about any of this anymore. The Earth's sixth mass extinction event is underway, and it's unstoppable. Runaway global warming has already arrived, and it's unstoppable. The collapse of human civilization has already begun, obviously, and it's unstoppable. And the coming crash of human population is now unstoppable too. What all this means is that the community of life on this planet is now in existential crisis, meaning that it is in question whether the community of life will be able to continue. We can now understand that relatively near-term human extinction, or at least near-term near extinction, is a very real possibility and could happen in a matter of a few decades from now. As people like Richard Heinberg and John Michael Greer and many others have taught us to understand, this existential crisis is not a problem we can solve, but a predicament to which we must quickly adapt. We've gone well beyond the point where solutions are possible. It's a predicament. We simply cannot solve this. Those of us who have been following these matters for years have had a growing sense of this for some time now, but the situation has accelerated quite dramatically in the last few years. Significantly, one of the things that's different now is that many millions of people are waking up to our predicament. Perhaps the most dramatic sign we've seen of this was in the summer of 2018, when a well-respected UK professor of sustainability, Dr. Jem Bendell, put his academic career on hold to immerse himself in a comprehensive study of everything that scientists knew about global warming at that time. He tried to publish his resulting paper in academic journals, but was repeatedly rejected. Eventually, he self-published, posting a PDF of his dense 35-page paper online, making it freely accessible. Titled Deep Adaptation, A Map for Navigating Climate Tragedy, it went viral. More than 1 million people have since downloaded it, and tens of thousands have self-organized into groups exploring its implications. I'm not aware of anything like this ever happening before. Jem Bendell's perspective has also been very influential in the emergence of Extinction Rebellion in the UK, one of the most radical and ambitious protest movements to emerge in recent years. But deep adaptation is only one of the reasons that today, perhaps tens of millions of people are deeply concerned that humanity, as well as much of life on this planet, could well become extinct in the relatively near future. We're all seeing the term existential risk appearing in the media with increasing frequency these days, but it somehow has the same kind of feeling as the term climate change. Broadly accurate, but not as sharply focused as global warming. Existential risk was first properly defined by Swedish philosopher Nick Bostrom, who says, an existential risk is one that threatens the premature extinction of Earth-originating intelligent life, or the permanent and drastic destruction of its potential for desirable future development. Well, we live at a time of converging existential risks, creating a planetary existential predicament or existential crisis. Over the coming years of this decade, we will see existential risk increasingly become the central focus of research and debate and activism and agony all over the world as humanity awakens to its fundamental predicament and struggles to adjust to this new reality. The possibility of extinction, both a sixth mass extinction of species and the demise of the human species, will be an increasingly prominent matter of concern and debate, especially in this decade. The 2020s will be the decade in which humanity either comes to terms with this possibility and responds appropriately, or visibly fails. Here's the essence of the science behind this perspective that has been developing among those who have dedicated their lives to understanding our predicament, offered by Dr. B. Sidney Smith at a conference at Virginia Tech 2 years ago. Smith says, the science is now crystal clear. We've got at best 10 years to wean ourselves off fossil fuels, or we'll see at least 4 degrees centigrade of additional warming, possibly as soon as 2040, certainly by 2080, with no means whatever to bring the climate back into equilibrium. It's now generally believed by that point, feedback loops will kick in, driving temperatures as much as 10 degrees higher centigrade, no matter what we do. God alone knows if the biosphere will live or die, he says, in the aftermath of that event. At a minimum, the remaining ecosystems will collapse. Most species will go extinct, and it's questionable whether humanity will survive in any form much beyond the end of the century. And even if it does, there will be no resource base from which to make a new civilization, possibly for millennia. And we can't change course. Knowing full well the consequences, the human system lurches on helplessly, steadily increasing year by year the release of greenhouse gases into the climate system. If this civilization were to continue another 20 years, he says, it would mean omnicide. It's fortunate indeed that it cannot continue. Neither technology, nor renewable energy, nor political revolution are going to stay this civilization's collapse. Well, this is a very sober and thoroughly documented science-based assessment. As he says, it's questionable whether humanity will survive in any form much beyond the end of this century. And even if it does, there will be no resource base from which to make a new civilization, possibly for millennia. So, from this perspective, there will be no successor human civilization after this one is gone. And the very survival of humanity is increasingly questionable and increasingly in doubt. That's where we are. The problem, as Australian philosopher and ethicist Toby Ord says, is humanity lacks the maturity, coordination, and foresight necessary to avoid making mistakes from which we could never recover. As the gap between our power and our wisdom grows, our future is subject to an ever-increasing level of risk. That's kind of putting the finger on it, isn't it? The growing gap between our power and our wisdom. Toby Ord at Oxford University is one of a handful of the most important voices to emerge around the topic of existential risk in recent years, and recently published The Precipice, Existential Risk and the Future of Humanity, which is essential reading for those of us who feel some responsibility for the future, as it's one of the best introductions exploring this existential predicament from a moral and ethical perspective, not merely scientific or social. Early on, he says, we see a species precariously close to self-destruction, with a future of immense promise hanging in the balance. And which way that balance tips becomes our most urgent public concern. Well, it ought to be our most urgent public concern, but it's not yet. One of the other emerging voices in all of this is Thomas Moynihan at Oxford University's Future of Humanity Institute, who's even more explicit about putting existential risk in a moral context. He says, today we define what we now call existential risks as threats that are of unique moral importance because they endanger the very existence of morality in the world, whether by causing our outright extinction or by irreversibly curtailing our potential to achieve good things. In other words, the awareness of the possibility of extinction brings us to the ultimate moral issue, our ethical responsibility for the continued existence of ethics and responsibility itself. Moynihan is saying that what is at stake is the very existence of ethics and responsibility. And he makes the crucial point that not all existential risks are extinction scenarios. Some existential risks could result in worse than death scenarios, such as the permanent installation of an oppressive totalitarian regime, which, he says, through technological dominance and omnipresent surveillance, becomes impossible to overthrow. Here, Homo sapiens would survive, but its potential would be cruelly curtailed and its existence defined only by untold suffering. Such a totalitarian regime could be human or extraterrestrial or emerge from artificial intelligence. Becoming aware of existential risk and charting appropriate responses and possible paths forward becomes a momentous and extremely urgent responsibility in our time. And who can bear that responsibility? Who could we trust with that? Who's qualified? Who is even willing to face this? What is our responsibility in this existential crisis? Part of the difficulty here is that we are a young and immature species, perhaps roughly at the stage of early adolescence. And we're being thrust into a situation that requires maturity and wisdom and ethical clarity and other capacities that we simply have not yet developed. As we survey the increasing division and conflict that we see in the world today, we can legitimately ask whether there are any adults in the room, or whether we're in a situation like the parable that William Golding penned just over 60 years ago in Lord of the Flies, where in the complete absence of adults, youngsters stranded on an island descended into violent, self-terminating chaos. What adults can we look to for guidance now? Given this situation, the Monastery Academy is now creating the Beyond Extinction Summit, a multi-day global online event to be held in early 2022. The summit will bring together a wide variety of perspectives featuring contributions from some of the world's most significant voices and perspectives to explore both humanity's existential risks and evolutionary potential. Represented will be visionaries, activists, philosophers, ethicists, academic researchers, journalists, astrobiologists, cosmologists, indigenous elders, practitioners, entrepreneurs, permaculturists, and technology innovators, as well as spiritual and religious leaders. We anticipate a total of perhaps 70 presenters with several co-hosts. And the event design will offer a rich tapestry of interviews and presentations and panel discussions and community dialogues, which together could help clarify a path forward for humanity. While the threat of near-term extinction has become a prominent theme in human culture and discourse, this is still primarily at subterranean or less than conscious levels. It's something that many people do not want to think about and would rather avoid, but they are nevertheless haunted by it daily. Along with all life on this planet, humanity faces a truly existential crisis which casts profound doubt on even the possibility of a viable future. But the nature of this Anthropocene predicament is widely unacknowledged, misunderstood, and undiscussed, and therefore remains largely ignored or denied. For humanity to rise to the level of response that will be required to ensure that existential risk does not lead inexorably to humanity's self-termination, we will need to first squarely face the realities of possible extinction. The decisions we make in the next few years, and even how we make those decisions, could have enormous consequences over timescales that are cosmic in proportion. The Beyond Extinction Summit seeks to increase awareness of the realities of existential risk. and to raise the level of consideration so that it includes the moral, the spiritual, and the sacred. This is a conversation that needs to be accessible to millions. Gathering at the precipice of catastrophe, the Beyond Extinction Summit calls together many of our greatest minds and hearts to consider the dimensions and meaning of our crisis and to explore the most ethical and evolutionarily creative responses available to us, including possible pathways for course correction and ultimate recovery. The summit is less about survival than it is about attempting to map a course to the next stage of human evolution, species adulthood, and biosphere emergence, all in the context of the long evolutionary arc of the moral universe. The intention in this summit is to create an environment in which meaningful dialogue and inquiry can reveal deeper understanding and ignite higher motivations and mobilize appropriate action. There are many authors and thinkers and activists who have something important to say about all this, but there is currently no forum for this conversation and little access to those limited forums that do exist. Many who have important contributions to offer in this predicament and have been quietly at work on these issues for many years are not yet even aware of each other. So part of the intention of the summit is to increase the level of collaboration and co-creation across the community of those who need to be having this conversation together. This discussion will not be binary, survival versus extinction, but nuanced and generative. Ensuring mere survival has already proved an inadequate motivation for the sacrifices that are needed to create a viable future. Our existential crisis demands humanity's wisest and most careful consideration. Well, that's enough of an introduction for now. We'll soon be releasing a series of interviews on topics of the Beyond Extinction Summit. And if you'd like to receive information about the Beyond Extinction Summit as it develops over the next several months, please subscribe to our Deep Revolution YouTube channel. And if you'd like to be involved in the creation of this historic event, please send me an email, michael@deeprevolution.net. Thank you for listening. Blessings.